So you want to get into wildlife photography? No worries. Let's talk about the things you're going to need, the settings you might want to use, and a great way to get in some practice to improve your wildlife photography. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week, we're going to talk all about how you can get into wildlife photography, going from having never done it before to becoming good at it, to becoming knowledgeable about how to do it, where to go, the settings, the equipment, all that kind of stuff. So let's just dive straight in. Let's talk first of all about the kind of equipment you might want to use for wildlife photography. Now, to be fair, there is a big variety of different stuff you could use to actually create wildlife photos, to go out and take those wildlife photos. Now, of course, you're going to need a camera, and here actually full frame is great, but sometimes APS-C or even Micro Four Thirds can work in your favor because they can give you more reach from your lenses. 200mm lens on a Micro Four Thirds camera is actually going to be the full frame equivalent of 400mm. So here, shooting with a Micro Four Thirds camera can actually be fantastic because they tend to be overall a smaller system, but you're getting more reach out of those lenses. But of course, full frame is great as well, and APS-C kind of rides that line between the two. Now, in an ideal world, you might have a camera that is able to bump up that ISO without suffering too much from digital noise, and that's because we're going to use a much faster shutter speed, and some of these long lenses have a bit more of a stopped down aperture. So being able to bump up that ISO without having to worry about noise is going to really help to actually negate some of those issues we might come across later on. Now, in terms of lens, you can use a lot of different lenses. A 70-200 is absolutely fine, but even longer will give you maybe more opportunity and allow you to get really nice photos without having to approach animals too much. So something like a 70-300mm lens is great if you're kind of starting out with this kind of stuff, because that's not going to necessarily break the bank compared to some of these other options. I was using the Canon RF 100-500mm lens, which is a beautiful lens and great for this kind of stuff, but there are a huge number of lenses that you can choose for this. Ultimately though, it comes down to having a pretty long focal length, and a zoom is even better because it allows you to actually be a bit more flexible with how long you want that focal length to be. This is all going to allow you to stay further away from the animals, which does a few different things. It's kinder to the animals. It allows you to not spook them so that you don't actually chase them away, which is not ideal for then getting a photograph of them. And it also allows you to get those photos nice and close up, which you wouldn't be able to do. Let's say you took a 35mm lens out, you're probably not going to get many close-up photos of animals. It's going to be a wider shot realistically. It's then up to you whether you want to bring a tripod or a monopod. I think it can be really useful in some situations, especially if you have very heavy gear. If you know you're going to set up in a location, which we're going to come onto in a second, it can be handy to have a tripod that you can just set up on, sit back, relax, be patient, and you don't have to handhold this big setup all day. It is going to slow you down a little bit in terms of, first of all, in terms of moving around, and also in terms of reacting to something happening. If you set up a tripod, you're sort of facing this way, something happens over there. If you're handheld, you can just swing around. With a tripod, you are going to have to do a bit more maneuvering. So it slows you down a little bit, but if you are pointed, let's say at a body of water that animals are going to, sometimes a tripod can be very useful to alleviate some of that, arm ache the next day. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the settings you might want to use before we get onto things like location and how you might want to approach this in general. In terms of settings, it's probably a good idea to go for a higher or a faster shutter speed. That's going to allow you to capture fast-moving action. It's going to offset any potential camera shake from you holding the lens, especially if it's a long lens. So generally, I will always look to shoot probably about 1/640th of a second or faster. 1/800th of a second, I think always works really well. 1,000th of a second if you want to capture like water splashing and stuff like that, or even faster if you want to. But I think going slower than that, 1/400th of a second, is probably the slowest I would go with a long lens, because I'm trying to offset any natural shake that might be happening, which is kind of amplified by the longer focal length. And then of course, actual fast moving subjects as well. It's important, if they're going to be even slightly blurred, it's going to look soft, it's not going to look good. So you want that nice sharp end result, which a big part of that is using a nice fast shutter speed. You want to make sure that ISO is bumped up enough to compensate for how much darker it's going to be in the exposure by having a faster shutter speed. And the aperture, generally, I'll just set it to whatever the fastest it's able to be. And that just depends on the lens. You know, a more expensive lens will often give you a faster aperture at a longer focal length. But let's say you're going for something like a 70 to 300, you know, a slightly more affordable option. I would just always set it to the fastest available aperture because I think it's going to give me the best result in terms of my exposure and the end result look of the image. Okay, so now we've talked about the settings, the equipment, all that kind of stuff. Let's get on to things like location and how you're actually going to approach these photos. So first of all, location's the biggest one. You want to be going somewhere where the animals are, because if you're kind of traipsing around looking for animals in a wood, let's say, that's going to be pretty difficult because a lot of animals are going to hear you coming way before you're ever going to see them, and they're going to leave because you'll be crunching stuff and all that kind of thing. So they're not going to stick around for you to take photos of them. You want to head somewhere where the animals are, and especially when you're starting out, you want to head somewhere you can pretty much guarantee you're going to be able to get some photos, because that's going to allow you to practice composition. It's going to allow you to practice tracking animals, you know, reacting to things happening, so you can just bring the lens up. That's all stuff you need a bit of experience with to kind of get used to it, to then become better at it. When you first start, it can be difficult to track an animal properly, especially a bird flying, let's say. They're very fast. It can be difficult to bring the lens up, latch onto it, and track it as it moves. But if you go somewhere where there are lots of birds constantly, that's going to become easier to practice and become better at it. So for example, a local park can work really well, especially if it's a nature park as opposed to like a dog park. If you go to a local nature park and there's a pond or a lake or anything like that, you're almost guaranteed to find birds there. And that's a great way of practicing tracking those birds in flight. Even if they're seagulls, even if they're ducks, even if they're not particularly interesting birds, no offense to seagulls or ducks, you can actually get that practice in, become more experienced, and then when you go somewhere like a bird hide, for example, or some wetlands or something like that, you're already going to have that experience and that practice to be able to capture those photos of the more interesting birds. This is also true of things like deer. If you go out to a forest to look for deer, that's going to be very difficult because, like I say, they're going to leave probably before you even see them. But if you head somewhere like Richmond Park, for example, is a great spot. You can practice photographing deer. Now, the deer in Richmond Park, for example, or in other areas where there are lots of deer, the New Forest, for example, you've got the ponies, you've got all kinds of stuff there as well, are probably not going to be moving around a lot. But that's great. It gives you an opportunity to practice a bit of composition, to practice a bit of how do you want to compose the shot? How do you want to set yourself up? And maybe that is a situation where you do have a tripod and you work out how you like to work with it. Do you like working handheld? Or do you like working with a tripod? And this is all super valuable experience, which allows you to really hone in some of these skills and actually work out the style you like to shoot in and how you actually like to compose these shots. Now, I know you're thinking, maybe you don't want to go to the New Forest or Richmond Park, or maybe you don't have a nature park super nearby. How else can you get some of this practice in? Well, there's a great way actually. If you have a pet, or if you know someone who has a pet, let's say a dog that likes to run, that can be a great way of going out, composing shots, tracking, just practicing a lot of those different skills. So for example, I take my dog Nala out and about all over the place, and she loves to run. So if I want to practice that skill of kind of tracking, composing shots, trying to work out how I want to shoot, shooting handheld, reacting to things going on around me, I can take her out with the camera, with the long lens, and take photos of her running around. Now, it's a nice thing to do, to be honest. You can end up with some lovely photos of your pet or of someone else's pet. People love photos of their pets, so it's kind of a win-win. But you get to really practice these skills in a pretty safe and reliable environment. And by reliable, what I mean is you are always going to have a shot to take, which is not always the case with wildlife photography. Patience is going to be absolutely key when it comes to wildlife. And that is something that you can practice at the nature park, something you can practice down by the beach, wherever it is you might go. Patience is really, really key. If you have a specific bird or animal in mind that you want to take a photo of, it's worth doing some research about that animal or bird first, because that's going to really inform how you might take a photograph. So for example, when they come out to water, do they come out more around dusk and maybe sunrise as opposed to the middle of the day? Do they kind of hide away in bushes or trees or whatever it might be in the middle of the day, but they come out at sort of dusk and sunrise? So is that a better time to go? All that kind of information is going to be valuable in working out where to take a photo of these animals or birds and actually how to go and do that. That way you can go and set yourself up in a place that you're pretty sure you're going to find one of these animals, one of these birds. You can be patient there, sit, wait for something to come into your frame. A body of water is pretty much always a good idea because a lot of animals will naturally gravitate at different times of day to a body of water. So if you go and look for something like that and set yourself up, that's going to be great. Heading to bird hides within kind of nature reserves or wetlands or something like that, that's a great way of capturing interesting images of different types of birds that you might not find at a local nature park or down by the sea. Now, those are kind of my tips for getting started into wildlife photography, but I'd love to hear if you have some tips of your own. So absolutely let me know down in the comments if there's other things you think that I've missed here when getting into wildlife photography. If someone was coming to you to say, you know, I want to take photos of deer, I want to take photos of birds, I don't know where to start. What else would you say to them which we haven't said here? Let's get a conversation going down there. Otherwise, of course, you can check out a bunch of different kit used for these photos in this video and all that kind of stuff down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well if you enjoyed the video, because there's new content all of the time. I will, of course, see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.